So now we're going to talk a little bit about risk-based surveillance. And again, the RiskServe project, a lot of what I'm going to talk about here came from Module 2 in the training series on risk-based surveillance. It's not really an in-depth module, but there's good information about the basics of risk-based surveillance. So if you want to have a look at that, I would think it's a good idea. So what we're going to talk about is just basic principles of risk-based surveillance, how to apply a simple risk-based approach in the design of a surveillance program, and similarities and differences between conventional and risk-based surveillance. So first off, we're going to do this question. So if you were the king or queen of the EU, which of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 diseases would you think should receive the highest priority for surveillance and disease control in the EU? So yeah, it's interesting. African swine fever is, yeah, a pretty important disease. Bovine spongiform encephalopathy, I guess for trade is still Hypatia, of course. Nobody picked rinderpest. So the point is that it depends about the pathogen and about what livestock industries are important in your country. And so I'm glad we got an answer for everything except rinderpest, and I can understand why African swine fever would be on everybody's mind right now. Okay, so we'll close that and move on. So the problem is I didn't get to fill out this chart. The problem is we all have limited resources. There's never enough resources in animal health surveillance in terms of finances, people, infrastructure, and there's many, 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 many hazards. And it's difficult to choose which ones to do and choose where to allocate our resources when it comes to surveillance. So we talk about the ratio between how much information you get per unit of cost. So there is a need for evidence-based decision-making, and we talk about that more and more and more, and that evidence comes for surveillance. We need not just surveillance information, but documented evidence. So all in all, that calls for an increase in surveillance. But as I said, the resources are always limited, so we try to aim to increase the ratio of information to cost so that we get more information for less cost. So the definition for risk-based surveillance is a surveillance program which uses risk assessment methods together with traditional design approaches. You don't usually see risk assessment methods alone, but they're most usually combined with traditional approaches. So the two together are used to design data collection and surveillance. So of course we talked about risk assessment yesterday. It's an element of risk analysis, and it considers both the likelihood of an undesirable event occurring and its biological and economic consequences. So the two things together are considered in risk assessment, and we use these two in risk-based surveillance. So risk-based surveillance uses information about the probability of the hazard occurring and the magnitude of its effects to design, plan, and interpret the results obtained from surveillance systems. So the objective is to identify surveillance needed to protect the most needed to protect animal health and the health of consumers, set priorities, and allocate resources effectively. So if we were going to evaluate a risk-based surveillance component, we would expect that it would be as good as or better than traditional surveillance in terms of efficacy. That is, the information that's produced would be of the same or higher quality, but the efficiency would be better. There's no point in doing risk-based surveillance if it costs more than regular surveillance. So the idea behind risk-based surveillance is to reduce the costs of surveillance. And we use risk risk-based approaches for two things. One is to prioritize hazards that have more serious consequences, hence the first question I gave you. And that can be both for human health and animal health, and also to prioritize subpopulations or strata that have higher risks of being infected. And here we're looking for subpopulations where we're more likely to find the disease. So prioritizing hazard risks, we use both of these ideas, the probability of an event occurring and the consequences, both direct loss of animals, treatments, production, and indirect, so cost for control, stamping out, quarantine, and vaccination. So both of those are considered. So an event like lightning, even if it has a high consequence, so rinderpest reoccurring would have a very, very high consequence, but the probability of that event occurring is very, very low. So it's not likely that we would consider spending a lot of money on rinderpest surveillance. The design steps for risk-based surveillance is first to use risk assessment to select hazards, then to select the strata that you want to sample at, and often we will use risk assessment to select the type of products or the type of animals. But in the final strata, where we sample the smallest level, we should always do random sampling. It can't be convenience sampling. It has to be random sampling. And in most cases, as many of you pointed out, the hazards that are the most important are defined by international recommendations and international regulations. So they're mandated. So we'll talk about targeted sampling or targeted surveillance. I talked about this morning. This is an older term than risk-based surveillance, and it's about targeting a specific high-risk strata to sample at to estimate whatever it is you're wanting to measure with your surveillance system. So I always like these examples for targeted surveillance and for sentinel surveillance. In many in Canada and the US, in the middle of those two countries, we have a disease called Western Equine Encephalitis, which is mosquito-borne. The reservoir is wild birds, and in the summertime, the risk can change from year to year and from time to time. It is a zoonotic disease, and it causes quite severe encephalitis in people, although the incidence is often still quite low, even when you have a high risk situation. So what we do is we have these little chicken farms in city parks, especially those close to water sources. And these chickens, because birds are the reservoir for Western equine encephalitis, the chickens are blood tested every week, and antibodies for Western equine encephalitis virus are tested. And when the antibody levels start going up in the chickens, then it's time for the city to do some sort of response. Either look at the wild bird population, look at mosquito pools, and sometimes, not so much recently, but we used to spray the whole city with pesticides to try to get rid of the mosquitoes. There are a lot of sentinel herd programs throughout much of the world. We have sentinel herds that we use in Canada for quite a few different diseases. Bovine virus diarrhea is one, and the idea is that you select these herds and you test them at a very, very high rate. So you select them in ways that they are strategically situated, either in high-risk regions, or sometimes we'll do them across the whole country, and test them frequently to try to get an idea about the changing risk for a certain hazard. So for risk-based surveillance, you use knowledge about risk factors to improve the probability that we will find the disease or the infection. And so risk-based surveillance should be more efficient at finding disease or infection than representative random surveillance. It might not be better at it, but it's more efficient. So it's cheaper because we're concentrating our sampling in these high-risk areas. But you have to know something about the disease. So if you don't know anything about risk factors for the disease, then it's very, very, very difficult to do risk-based surveillance. Comparing risk-based and conventional surveillance, the objectives are the same. Hazard selection is different. As we saw just in the last exercise, we can use risk-based approaches to select the hazards that we want to include in our surveillance system, or prioritize the use of our resources for surveillance. Case definition is the same. Test procedures are the same. When it comes to target populations, that's really where there's a difference between conventional surveillance and risk-based surveillance. In all of these, we use risk factors to define the region to test in, the species, the production group, the farms, the type of animals, and also the timing. So we use risk factors to determine what is the time of the year that we're most likely to find the disease in the population we're looking at, and then we focus our resources on testing at that time. So factors used to define high-risk strata are many. You can use just about any risk factor for a disease. And for common diseases, there are a lot of risk factors. So we know a lot about mastitis. We know a lot about BVD. We know a lot about Johne's disease, about many of the common diseases. So it will be easy for us to design risk-based surveillance to do surveillance for those diseases where there's lots of information. And because risk is a product of both likelihood and consequences, the highest risk factor may be the strata with the highest expected prevalence. So the place where we're most likely to find the disease, or it may be the strata where we have the highest hazard impact. So in Switzerland, there's far more dairy cattle than there are beef cattle. So we would focus our surveillance for Johne's disease, or for say listeria or something like that that affected milk and cheese production more on the dairy herds than we would on the beef herds. Or it can be a combination of both. I borrowed this slide from Jorn because it really sort of says in a nutshell what risk-based sampling does. Risk-based sampling increases the prevalence in the sample compared to the prevalence in the population. In a representative sample, the prevalence is the same or similar in both. In biased sampling, the prevalence in the sample will be probably different than the prevalence in the population because it's biased. So the important thing is that we know right off the bat when we design these surveillance systems that the prevalence in the samples that we're taking, because we're looking at high risk subpopulations, we expect the prevalence to be higher in our sample. So this makes it somewhat difficult to generalize prevalence estimates across the whole population because of the way that we sample. Statistical analysis is similar except for trying to estimate prevalence or comparing the two. So usually when you do risk-based surveillance, you look at the economic benefit of using it. So we'll have that additional analytical component. Communication of results is the same. Consequences are the same. Feedback mechanisms are a little bit different for risk-based surveillance. And we have to be a little bit careful with how we feed back information. So normally, in a risk analysis, we use surveillance information to support a risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication. But we have to be very careful if we're doing risk-based surveillance, if we use surveillance information to focus our surveillance on specific parts of the population. Because if we focus our surveillance on those parts of the population, we expect to get higher prevalence there. And if we use that then to feed back into the design of our surveillance system, we'll end up with a surveillance system where we're just sampling on those few areas, and we will miss any cases that might occur in any other parts of the country. So if we do that in a cyclical process, our surveillance will become more and more and more and more focused and narrower and narrower and narrower. So I think I have time to look at a couple of examples. I want to talk about BSE and then H5N1 and then hopefully Trichinella, because they're three totally different approaches to risk-based surveillance. So BSE is really the first important surveillance system with a risk-based design. And that was because of the challenges associated with BSE. BSE, even at its most common, was a rare disease. It was very expensive to diagnose. You had to cut the animal off the head, take out a piece of its brain, and do a complicated test on it to detect the prions. The incubation period was really, really, really long, so years, from probably an absolute minimum of 2 and most commonly about 5. Clinical signs were subtle and unspecific, and because you had to could only diagnose it in dead animals, the exit route, how the animal exited the population, became a risk factor, whether it was through emergency slaughter, non-ambulatory or casualty slaughter, routine slaughter. Different pathways that animals left became risk factors for surveillance. And at the same time, BSE became very important for trade. And so over a period of time, standards were developed in the OIE for international surveillance. And those standards were developed probably in the early 2000s, and they remain in place today. So BSE surveillance is based on a risk assessment that's performed in each country. And we classify countries into 3 categories of risk: negligible risk, controlled risk, and undetermined risk. And the risk assessment is based on a history of feeding practices, whether they fed meat and bone meal from cattle to cattle, past surveillance, whether there was good surveillance and it detected cases or not, and the documentation of the population. That is, whether farms were identified and individual cattle were identified, and whether their movements were tracked, and efforts for clinical detection of cases. So based on these, we divided the surveillance system into 2 types of surveillance, called surveillance A for the controlled risk, and surveillance B for the undetermined risk. So surveillance A for controlled risk, that is where you have some cases, but you haven't got good enough surveillance, and you've fed prions, fed meat and bone meal to your cattle in the past, you would enter into the controlled risk. And the worst category was undetermined risk, where you had no idea what was going on in your country. And negligible risk would be countries where there was lots of surveillance, minimal feeding of meat and bone meal, and most importantly, surveillance to demonstrate that there were no cases in the country. So that was surveillance B, and the other one is surveillance A. And different surveillance systems had to get different surveillance points. And this is the chart from the OIE's chapter on BSE surveillance about type A and type B surveillance. So type B surveillance, remember, is the low-risk countries. Type A surveillance is the high-risk countries. If you have more than 1 million animals, you needed 300,000 points in type A and half that in type B, so 150,000 points. But what's important is how you achieve those points. So surveillance points were allocated according to the age of the animal, because BSE is most commonly seen in older animals. In an animal is younger than a year of age, it is highly unlikely that you'll be able to diagnose it. And by the way the animals left the population, either as routine slaughter, fallen stock, casualty slaughter, or clinical suspects. You're probably mostly familiar with this, I think. So the point is that you receive the most points for clinical suspects, followed by casualty slaughter, followed by fallen stock, followed by routine slaughter, and the most points for animals of a certain age group, so age 4 to 9 years of age. So each country had to get the right number of points, and it was most advantageous for you to develop surveillance in your own country to get these points as cheaply as you possibly could. So you'd focus on clinical suspect, casualty slaughter, fallen stock, and less on routine slaughter. So that's how that risk-based surveillance system was implemented. And if you break that down into sort of a decision tree, there are country level risks, there are animal level risk factors. The animal level risk factors are based on how the animal exits the population and the animal's age. So those were the 3 risk factors that were used to focus surveillance on certain subgroups in the population. So that changed the way we look at surveillance. The next one I want to talk about is risk-based surveillance for H5N1 in avian influenza in wild birds in Great Britain. So this is a geographical approach. The BSC one was about age and how animals exited the population. This risk-based approach is about geographical location and the type of wild birds there are in the country. So they were focusing this on surveillance for H5N1. We know that infections with highly pathogenic AI occurs in domestic birds, but the and wild birds, but the infection is quite rare, and susceptibility varies greatly between wild bird species. Clinical disease in domestic poultry is rare because it's a low path AI in poultry, and it's mostly subclinical in wild birds, but wild birds pose a significant threat to domestic poultry. So what they did was they wanted a surveillance purpose for early detection of H5N1 in poultry. They divided the country into surveillance units, each one 10 kilometers square. And for each 10 kilometer square area, they estimated the probability of AI introduction by wild birds. And they also looked at the presence of poultry in each of those areas, and then they combined the first one and the second one for an overall risk estimate for each 10 kilometer area, and then they focused their surveillance on the high risk areas. So the probability of introduction for each 10 kilometer area, they estimated the abundance of each of 24 species, and these 24 species were ranked by importance by their probability of being infected, their abundance in the area, and seasonal patterns, as well as their whether they were known to mix with domestic poultry, and whether they were solitary or lived in flocks, so their social behavior. The next step was and so they created a map like this. So the dark blue is high-risk areas where there were lots of poultry, lots of wild birds that were reservoirs for H5N1. The yellow areas the yellow squares were areas where there were few of these birds present. Then they put in a number of poultry per 10 kilometer squared area, and this was the consequences to that 10 square area if there was an introduction. So they looked at production type, hatchery versus broiler versus layer. They looked at whether there were commercial birds versus backyard birds, whether the birds were kept indoors, free range, had access to a pond. In the case of commercial ducks, their distance to ponds and rivers, to natural ponds and rivers and lakes. And they used a mixture of quantitative and qualitative metrics to rank the 10 square kilometer areas from 1 to 6. And here is the map that they produced from this. So this was the blue is high risk areas and yellow is low risk areas. And the third step was to combine the two of them. So they just took the values for each square for the wild birds times the values for each square for the poultry, and they came up with a third map, which is the combined risk. And to me, it looks, the idea is quite novel, and lots of countries do this now. But it seems to be that there's not that much of a savings. That well, I guess there is. Probably the top half of the country, the top half of the United Kingdom, you may not do so much surveillance in it. So you would focus your surveillance on the bottom half of the country, of the United Kingdom. So that's risk-based surveillance based on geographical units. The last one I'm going to talk about is trichinella, because it is set in a different setting, and it's also looks at risk factors for farms, and farms are categorized as being high risk and low risk. So trichinella, of course, can cause a life-threatening disease in people. The prevalence in the EU in pigs is very low, but we still test many pigs at slaughter and get very few positives. So the cost for that information is very high because the cost of testing is high. It's not transmitted between pigs except via cannibalism, and feeding raw waste that has infected meat is a risk factor. Eating carcasses containing infectious larvae is a risk factor. Rodents and outdoor rearing of pigs are risk factors because rodents can be infected, and age is a risk factor. So the older the pigs are, the higher is their probability of being infected. So these were used to create risks. These were used as risk factors to create strata for the farms. And here's the paper from Liz Al. Here's the risk factors from Liz Albin's papers. They looked at housing, rodent control, feed sources, storing of feed, disposal of dead animals, rubbish dumps, purchase of piglets, identification of piglets, in the introduction of new animals, and access to outdoor facilities. And they ranked the farms as high or low risk. And then they developed this algorithm to classify farms in countries to determine what sort of surveillance the country had to do. So if controlled housing compartments had been established in the country and there was regular auditing and biosecurity requirements were in place, if that is true and the country had previously obtained a negligible risk status for trichinella, there was no trichinella required in the control housing, so that would be the low risk areas, but they still had to test all animals from the high risk farms. So you could follow this through. If the country had not done any of this risk assessment, then it would keep testing all the animals in that went to slaughter at slaughter. So the idea is that in countries, you would sample 10% of pigs from low-risk farms, sample all pigs from high-risk farms, and sample all breeding pigs. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the whole algorithm. It essentially was a way of using this country and the farms to differentiate farms into high and low risk, and to allow countries to reduce the amount of sampling they did from farms that were low risk. So advantages and disadvantages of of conventional versus risk-based surveillance. Conventional, of course, there's many methods available. We've been doing it for a long time. It's commonly accepted. The methods are well validated. but it can be expensive in terms of the cost for information gain. Sometimes there's low information content if all the animals negative, and it's not efficient. Risk-based surveillance should give you a higher benefit to cost ratio. It should be more efficient, and it's more suitable for rare events because you can focus your surveillance on the substrata of the population where you're more likely to find the disease. Data is not always available. We still need a lot of analytical methods, especially for doing things like estimating prevalence in the population. And equivalence assessment between countries has not yet been developed, and it's becoming more accepted, but it's not completely accepted. Okay, so here is our next question, Tanya. So I'm not picking particularly on Italy here, other than because I love the shape of Italy. So in Italy, I would think, and I'm just guessing here, that African swine fever is likely to enter from the north, either through transmission among wild boar or transmission to wild boar in northern Italy. So if they set up a surveillance system in this perimeter, north of this red line, and they tested all hunter killed, road killed, and found dead wild boar in that area above the red line, and all tested negative, would you accept live pig imports from Italy? So the answer is yes or no. So are you a risk taker, or are you a conservative if you're deciding this for your country? So I can't see the results, Tanya. I think I'm not a whatchamacallit for this. I'm not a coordinator, director, or I forget what you call it. Oh, that was good. Okay, 18.
Did you sign out again?
It kicked me out. I had to re-sign in. I was going to tell you and I forgot. Sorry. Okay, a few more people.
Maybe we can stop now.
Sure. So most people said no. Some people said yes. I guess I would have been cautious as well. And having done surveillance for a long time, I've become quite skeptical, and I'll give you one example next. So I probably wouldn't accept them either. So I'm gonna keep going. Are there any questions? Well, let's talk about this next example. So that's the question. So this is, I've done a few things in surveillance that have not worked out really well in my career. And this is one of them. Chronic wasting disease is a prion disease of wild and farmed, mostly white-tailed deer and also farmed elk. So when I was working in Canada, we had this disease in the center province called Saskatchewan. It wasn't present in Manitoba, and it wasn't present in Alberta. And there was an outbreak in the wild deer population where this circle was. So it's right up against the Alberta border, and I was working in Alberta at that time. CWD is still not considered, is not strongly considered to be a risk for people, although there are some people that think it is. At the time that I was doing this, the disease was in the news in Alberta and Saskatchewan. We had not had any cases in Alberta yet, but there was always a concern from the hunters about whether they would get the disease if they ate wild deer that they shot. So we did a risk-based surveillance system, and we did surveillance for about 200 kilometers from the Saskatchewan border in Alberta, and we did a really strong information campaign. We set up depots for where hunters could drop off the heads of their deer, and we conveniently located them. We did a strong communication program, and we collected heads for a couple of years in just this area and tested them, and we got a lot, and we'd find the odd case here, but the rest of the population were concerned. So hunters in the rest of the province were concerned that why weren't we testing their deer? So we made that available to them. So we set up some boxes for people to drop off their heads in different places on the west side of the province. And the year that we did that, we got cases all over the place. So while we were looking over here on this part of the border, the disease had jumped, and this is in wild deer, this is not from moving farm deer around, jumped halfway across the province and turned up in other places. So I've had a few other examples like that where even though you plan everything and use the best knowledge that you have, something unusual can happen. I think I'm going to skip this just because we only got 15 minutes left. What I want to point out is that you can use risk-based, where you use risk-based surveillance depends on what are your objectives. So to prioritize hazards, select stratum or selection of units within the stratum. For normal surveillance, for proving freedom from disease, or I forgot one column heading here. So if you were going to prove freedom from disease, you would prioritize hazards, but you shouldn't prioritize stratum, and you shouldn't select units within the stratum with risk-based approaches. If you're doing early detection, then you can prioritize hazards, prioritize stratum, but again, you should always do a random sample within the final strata. And then I'm going to skip these last couple of slides and go to the last problem because we only have 15 minutes left.